Communications and Public Affairs here at the Centre for Policy Studies. And our panel today is it time to rethink the Greenbelt, which is kindly being sponsored by the LPDF. Is the Greenbelt the green lungs of our towns and cities, or is it a mislabeled land choking growth? There are a few issues, I think, in politics that are as controversial as the idea of building on the Greenbelt. There are very few people who don't have an opinion, a strong opinion in one direction or the other, and I certainly hope that my panel today all have strong opinions, as indeed do you. I'll introduce them in a moment, but just to say we will open up to questions once I've abused my chair's privilege and asked a few questions myself. So do start thinking about those questions, which hopefully will end in a question mark. I don't want any statements or pontifications. Questions would be ideal. Thank you ever so much. So if I just go from my immediate left, we're delighted to be joined by Brandon Lewis, who's the MP for Great Yarmouth since 2010. He's had a long and distinguished ministerial career, including being Lord Chancellor and Northern Ireland Secretary, but I think most relevant to this, Minister of State for Housing and Planning. We have Roger Mortlock, who's the CEO of the CPRE, the Countryside Charity, and has held that position since May 2023. And was previously Chief Executive of the Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust. We then have Anya Martin, who's the co-director of PricedOut, the campaign for affordable housing. She's also an advisor for London YIMBY and one of the most interesting or infuriating voices on housing, depending on which side of the fence you sit, but well worth a follow on Twitter regardless. And then finally, we have Paul Brocklehurst, who is the chair of the Land Planning and Development Federation, has held that role since 2018, and thanks again for sponsoring this panel. I'm going to give all of our panelists 3 minutes each to make some opening remarks, and I'm going to ask Brandon to start.
Thank you. Look, I actually think I'm very fortunate that I live in a pretty rural part of the country. We have that green lung effectively built into where we are by the agricultural and the general structure and nature of what makes Norfolk such a fantastic county, and obviously particularly within that the greatest constituency in the country being Great Yarmouth. But we're also building houses, and we're building houses in the right places, and we're building houses of the tenures people need. I actually think the green belt is hugely important. The green belt creates a green lung, it creates differentiation. I think one of the shames that we see, and I have seen this in one place in my constituency, but you'd see it more generally elsewhere, is when we see a merging of different places, villages coming together, two distinct villages, because of development effectively becoming one, and therefore you start to lose the individual identity of each village or potentially town. And I think that gap between areas, those lungs between areas, are quite important, partly for community identity and area identity and regional identity. And I think there is an importance in terms of what the Greenbelt is set out to do in terms of creating a green lung, particularly around the most urban and built-up areas, where it is important. And I think I saw this particularly struck me during COVID when I was doing Zoom meetings with staff who I was fortunately sitting in my working from home during the COVID lockdown period with a lot of green space around me, but talking to staff who were dialing in from an apartment, often a one-bedroom, if they're lucky, a two-bedroom apartment with a child with no garden, no green space. The green space that is created around our domiciles is actually hugely important, and the green belt, I think, is an iconic totem for that. Having said that, it was developed in the 1930s. We currently have roughly 1.4% of the country developed with residential properties, something like that. Over 90% of the UK is not developed in any form for very good reason, and roughly 40% of that is green belt. There are parts of the green belt that are not green. They're not green belt in the sense of we think of these plush, lovely green areas. There are areas that most of us would think are brownfield, already got buildings on, that are classed as green belt, which means we've got developments in some areas that have got massive demand for housing, where there are already buildings that have to go through a very long, very painful, not always successful planning process. I know of areas at the moment where we've got buildings that are now effectively derelict because they're in green belt, the local authority won't give planning, and these buildings are no longer fit for the use they're originally in. They're being refused the ability to become housing in areas that there is massive pressure on housing. So my view is the green belt, to finish, because I think I'm just on 3 minutes, is hugely important. I think as Conservatives we have a duty to conserve and protect the green belt, We also need to be honest and open about the fact that the Greenbelt, like everything over the last 100 years roughly, needs to be reviewed and changed. And we should be braver about recognising what we want the Greenbelt to achieve, what it originally set out to achieve, and how do we do that in a way that is appropriate today. And that does mean actually being open about this is the time to not get rid of the Greenbelt. Actually, how do we review it and make sure that it is functioning for the way we want it today, potentially increasing the percentage of land that's Greenbelt, but at least making sure it's good land that is genuinely green and creates that green lung that we want and we need around our urban areas.
Thanks very much. Paul?
Thank you, Emma. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to try and keep to the 3 minutes, but may not be successful, but centre it around 4 points. Now, the first point I would like to make is that the Greenbelt is not a designation of landscape, ecological or environmental value. It is a land use classification. That's what it was intended to do. It was developed in the 1930s, 1940s as a reaction to the fear of urban sprawl. So effectively it's a coalescence policy. It is not a definition of qualitative status in terms of some environmental designation. We have other designations for that landscape. It's AONB, National Park, Sites of Special Scientific Interest, SPAs, the list goes on. So I think one of the first things to say is it is not an environmental designation, and it suffers from the same biodiversity loss that the rest of our countryside across England and the UK suffers from. So, first point. Next point, and I'm picking up on some stats that Brandon's mentioned, and I'm going to sound a little bit like, for those of you old enough, Stato from Baddiel and Skinner, but as I roll off some numbers. But absolutely right. I think we have to put everything in context. The actual residential development area in England is 1.3%. Our gardens then add another 4.9% to that. So it's 6.2% of the English land area is effectively residential. Greenbelt is 12.6%, and then AONB's, national parks, sites of special scientific interest are about 4 times the size of that as well. And then in addition, there are constraints like flooding that would add other issues for development. Now, I go through all of that process because from a development point of view, our planning policy has at its core a very strong focus on sustainability. And therefore, when somebody says there's plenty of other land to develop, that isn't correct, because otherwise we'll be developing in the middle of nowhere, and that is not sustainable. By definition, our greenbelts surround our 14 most sustainable locations in this country, and actually a lot of the time within the greenbelt are railway stations, tube stations, and other transport nodes, which would create the most logical basis for development that you could think of. That would be the true definition of sustainable. So that's my second point. Third point, that the weight given to Greenbelt in national planning policy is out of kilter with the benefits that the wider society get. It actually acts as it stymies development, and actually, because of its status within planning policy, it gives those local authorities that benefit from it, and benefit, I put an inverted comma around, but they benefit from Greenbelt, and therefore they feel under no incentive to make local plans, because they do not experience unplanned development if they have no local plan. And that is really at the heart of some of the issues regionally, which create intergenerational unfairness. It creates the unaffordability in Greenbelt local authorities. Take Tandridge, take Waverley, take Guildford. All of these have large areas of Greenbelt, and they are the most unaffordable areas in the country. And that would be the same in and around Birmingham, in and around Manchester, with those Greenbelt local authorities as well. So it isn't just London that creates the issue. And my fourth point is, I think there's a poor level of discourse at the political level on Greenbelt. I think sometimes Greenbelt gets confused with Greenfield, and I think it then can get confused, as I've outlined, with environmental designations. It's not. And I also think that the public are not as closed-minded as people think to development on the Greenbelt. We've just undertaken some polling, which I'm happy to provide to anybody that wishes to use it. And if asked a simple question, do you agree with development on the Greenbelt? Surprise, surprise, -6% net support. But then if you put in that into context, would Greenbelt deliver high levels of affordable housing? That support goes to +9%. And then if you also add on that a lot of Greenbelt neither has biodiversity value or public access at all, and going to Brandon's point, we all realise the benefit of access during the COVID lockdowns, then that net support goes to +11%. So I think if we have a educated debate on the Greenbelt and highlight the benefits of developing on it, you can actually, in the right locations, you can actually get this public support. And that is why, do I think it needs to be rethought at this point in time? Absolutely, I do.
Thank you. Anya?
Thank you. Afternoon all, and thank you for having me. Just as an introduction, I'm here representing PricedOut, which is a campaign group. It's a group of renters who are very, very upset about rising house prices, rising rents, and to kind of set that into context a bit, house prices in England have risen by 400% in real terms since the 1970s. And that is huge by international standards, where the OECD average is about 100%. So we are looking at 4 times as much. Rents have done very similar. And then in terms of what that actually means, if you haven't rented in the last 10 or 20 years, you might not realise quite how bad it has actually become. I mean, we are seeing things like queues for viewings for flats, no matter how dire they are, how low quality. You're having bidding wars, you know, the rents are astronomical, the quality is abysmal. And that really has quite a material impact on people's lives. It's not a very nice way to live. So housing is a problem we need to fix. It is a problem that is largely, in my view, dependent on supply, and especially supply in high demand areas where people are competing for this housing. We build far less as a proportion of our stock relative to the size of our population than comparator countries. And we also build it in the wrong places. We tend to push it into isolated estates that are quite far from job opportunities and things like that, which makes people's lives harder, and it also is less impactful in terms of the reducing prices and reducing rents. Now, one of the reasons for this is that we do have a particularly and unusually obstructive planning system, and the Greenbelt is one of the things within that system that makes it quite difficult to build in and around cities. I mean, as my colleagues have already discussed, property covers very little of our country. The Greenbelt, however, is almost 13%. So it is a very, very large area, and it's a very, very large area specifically where you want to be building housing because you have access to jobs, you have access to amenities, you have access to public transport. And there's a great potential there for impact on housing affordability. So there's a paper by a couple of academics at LSE who found that if you just reduced the level of obstruction in planning in the southeast, which is, as you know, there's a very, very large Greenbelt surrounding London. It's actually 3 or 4 times the size of Greater London. If you reduce the kind of planning obstructionism in that area just to the level of the northeast, which is less obstructive, you could see house prices fall by 25%, which is massive, right? This would make a huge difference to people's abilities to own their own home, to start their own families, to move to London for work, to find better work, and so on. The green belt is obviously a barrier. Contrary to the name, it's not necessarily green. It does include previously developed land. It does include petrol stations and things like that. It's nothing to do with scenic beauty. We already have areas of outstanding natural beauty and things like that. And the other thing is it doesn't really meet what it's supposed to be doing. It's not environmentally friendly to force people to live further away from the cities they want to live in. If you are close to a city, that offers potential for density, right? Because more people are willing to live at higher densities if it's close to job opportunities. So you're kind of forcing development to leapfrog further away from the city beyond the green belt, where it must then be built at lower densities. So you're adding more pressure to land, you're adding more requirement for driving, less ability to use public transport, and all of these other things that have quite important carbon impacts. And of course, a lot of greenbelt land is also used for intensive farming. So from a biodiversity perspective, it's not actually biodiverse, it's incredibly unbiodiverse. So having very much gone for the jugular of the greenbelt there, I am now going to be slightly more conciliatory. Though I am a very annoying activist, I also sense a battle that I cannot win, right? The green belt is so perfectly politically insulated. It's got a great branding. You know, everyone thinks you're talking about the Chilterns or something like that when of course they have other designations to protect them. So how do you reform this in a way that is politically feasible? I think there are lots of ways. There are parish councils that want to release land within their own greenbelt areas but are prevented from doing so by either some national policy or by the higher authority. If you have these locals who are in favour of development because it will allow them to develop services they need, why get in their way? Because that political problem is solved for you. I don't want to go too much over time, and I sense that I am, but there are tools that you can use to give local areas the ability to vote in favour of new development in return for payments towards local services. Some of that is in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. Why not look at extending it to villages or things like that? And then, of course, you know, some of it you just have to be reasonable. Central government has to intervene on some of these things. Things like land around train stations. Why do we have train stations that are surrounded by intensive agriculture? It's just not good use of land. I think most people will agree this is a very inefficient way for us to use that land, given the potential carbon reduction impacts that we can have by using it. So it's a combination of find the amenable ways to local communities to release land as and when they support it. There's lots of them. And then also, let's be reasonable, you have to release some of it. Brownfield sites around train stations. And I will leave it at there. Thank you.
Thank you. Last but not least, Roger.
Thank you. I'm going to agree with lots of what Anya said, but I don't think the Greenbelt is the solution. CPRE was instrumental in setting up the 14 areas of Greenbelt, so clearly we're in the fan camp of Greenbelt. And you know, a couple of months ago, another a Mori poll said 60% of people, even though they recognised we were living in a housing crisis, thought that the Greenbelt should be protected. So it's clearly still a popular, nearly 100 years on, it's still a popular policy. But I'm going to agree with the panel, unusually, that I think it's time to rethink the panel, and that some of the original purposes around preventing urban sprawl and settlement coalescence are probably not enough for a country that's facing a climate and a biodiversity emergency, and I think we need to add some more purposes. There's an interesting study I read a couple of months ago that was looking at international academics looking at the UK Greenbelt, absolutely jealous as hell about the amount of space we had allocated for the Greenbelt, but what they couldn't get their head round was why we weren't using it more effectively to tackle the climate and the nature emergencies. And I think that's one of the things that CPRE is calling for a more kind of nature and climate focus on Greenbelt allocations. This is land that could have an incredible role on air quality, on flood alleviation, on carbon storage, right next to the places where it's needed. But it's also the countryside next door for 30 million people. It's got higher rates of public access into the countryside than anywhere else in the countryside. 65% of the green belt is farmed. If we're serious about eating more veg in this country, and if we're serious about storing more carbon in place in lowland peat, most of our veg at the moment is grown in lowland peat. If we want to relocalise our food systems, where's the obvious place to do that? The obvious place to do that is, as the Victorians had with their network of glass houses, is in those places around our city centres, the green belt. So the changing face of our agricultural provision in the green belt could be really looked at as well. At the moment, only 20% of the green belt is covered by stewardship agreements, compared to about 50% elsewhere. We need to find new ways to incentivise farmers to do the right thing for nature and climate in the green belt. But just to come back on some of the claims that were made, I wish that the Greenbelt were the place where our affordable housing crisis was solved. Unfortunately, that's rarely the case. The Greenbelt is more often a place where executive homes are built with Chaffinch Drive, where once Chaffinches thrived, and there is no room for affordable housing. Promises made at master plan stage for 40–50% affordable housing and a slug of social rents are gradually undelivered in the course of those sites coming through. We've got room for 1.2 million homes on existing brownfield sites, and to deliver all those things that Anya talked so eloquently about in terms of creating higher density cities, the place to do that, we think, is on existing brownfield sites. So I think there is an absolute need to rethink the Greenbelt. You know, I do think, however, those existing purposes, not just about urban sprawl, but of encouraging urban regeneration, protecting our historic towns, and safeguarding our countryside, they're still relevant. But it's now time to add some new purposes to make sure the Greenbelt's ready for a 21st century.
Thank you. As I said, I will open it up to questions in about 10 minutes or so do start thinking about that. I think possibly the place to start, Paul, is you were shaking your head when Roger was talking about the types of properties that are built on the Greenbelt. Did you just want to elaborate that further?
Yeah, I mean, I did see a piece of research that was issued by CPRE a few months ago, I think, which suggested that affordable housing was 10%. I mean, we tried to get to the bottom of that, and we haven't been supplied with the data on which that was based. But I mean, what we have to remember is a lot of development that has taken place in the Greenbelt is on previously developed land, i.e. brownfield land. And the unfortunate thing about brownfield land, wherever it is that it has issues of contamination or previous use, demolition, which adds to the cost and means that affordable housing is the thing in the viability that gives way. So that's one thing. And then we also have to remember that effectively small developments of less than 10 units are exempt from affordable housing delivery. So what I'm not talking about, first of all, I think like Anya, I'm not saying the Greenbelt does not have a purpose, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with Roger's point about changing some of the criteria or benefits that you get from the Greenbelt, because actually, like most of the countryside, actually we need to change how the countryside is managed as well. So some of what Roger talks about, I understand. So I'm not talking about getting rid of the Greenbelt. I'm talking about actually using it logically in the logical places, in sustainable locations, to deliver the development that we want, and also to deliver open space that we might want that people can actually access. Because as you highlighted, Roger, a lot of land is agricultural. It is previously developed. It has not a public access sort of requirement on it, and that is wrong. And that is how we could start to use it if we got the right scale of development in the Greenbelt. So I don't think this is necessarily piecemeal development in the Greenbelt. It is properly thought through development in the Greenbelt, and it could address a number of the issues that Roger's highlighted.
Roger, the CPRE's State of the Greenbelt report called for the Greenbelt to become greener, wetter and more biodiverse, which I think in a lot of cases most people would agree with. But doesn't that capture the essence of the problem, in that a lot of the Greenbelt isn't green, wet or diverse. It is, as Anya points out, land around train stations and things. And actually, wouldn't a shift to, as Paul suggested, maybe an environmental designation more accurately capture the green bits of the green belt that I think most people agree they want to keep, and actually the not so green bits, take them out of the green belt, call them what they are, and be a bit more honest about what the green belt is and isn't, and therefore what it could and couldn't be.
Yeah, we've got no objection to existing brownfield sites in the greenbelt being redeveloped for housing or any other purposes. That's not our objection. We recognise that not all of the greenbelt has stayed green, and we also recognise in that report that between 6,000 and 10,000 homes a year are taken out of the greenbelt, are built on greenfield sites. Not on brownfield sites. I think our kind of frustration about the gradual erosion of the greenbelt site is not necessarily about people building on brownfield. Don't go for it, and not necessarily about the provision of affordable housing even in the greenbelt, where rural exception sites can give you an absolute great tool to do that. Our sort of worry is that even I was looking in Hertfordshire, say, a place which is full of greenbelt, they'd allocated grades of their greenbelt, and the ones that went for housing outside on an allocation outside of the plan was in the area of greenbelt they had designated as being of the most value. That just seems to be madness in a system where we're trying to kind of plan for a more biodiverse world. So I think yes, let's think about repurposing those brownfield sites in the greenbelt, but let's not continue to promote greenfield sites in the greenbelt when we've got room for 1.2 million homes on brownfield land in this country.
Is the problem when we talk about brownfield land, though, that brownfield land isn't necessarily in the right places? So, I mean, this report from the Centre for Policy Studies, the case for house building, found that London has enough brownfield to build about 24% of its projected housing need. But a lot of rural areas have almost no or no brownfield available. Most regions have about a third of the brownfield they need. So actually, pretending, I'm not suggesting that you are, of course, but people who pretend that we can build all the houses we need on brownfield, that's simply not true. We are going to have to consider other land, including the greenbelt, at some point. Maybe, Brandon, if I come to you, can we touch a little bit on the economic and social costs of the greenbelt? We've talked about the benefits, especially in your constituency, as you say, but aren't we doing quite a lot of damage to the growth potential of the UK by treating greenbelt as this kind of holy grail which cannot be touched or built on?
Well, I think we're doing a lot of damage to the economy of the UK by not building enough homes and future opportunities for people, which is a real issue as a party of opportunity and aspiration. I think there is an issue. The greenbelt has become one of those items that, I think as Paul said earlier on, it's almost become an untouchable thing. If you mention greenbelt, you're, as a politician on the front page of a newspaper, not for the best of reasons either. As predecessors of mine, I know particularly had issues with before I became the Housing and Planning Minister. And I think David, I appreciate I'm probably entirely biased on this, but I think David Cameron, when he brought the jobs together, when I took it on as Housing and Planning for the first time in a while, was very sensible, because what I think is also behind this is all of these different things are interlinked. So it isn't just about the greenbelt. There is a wider issue with our planning system at the moment that we need to deal with, and we need to continue some of the reforms I think we were making. Ultimately, we do need to make sure the local authorities are doing local plans. I think Paul's absolutely right. I was a council leader. I was embarrassed as housing minister because continually, both the Secretary of State and mine's home district, where I'd been leader and he was still the MP at the time, was like in the bottom three of the country for not having done a local plan, and constantly in bright red. And the reason they hadn't done a local plan was a mixture of, and they come down to the same thing really, one, basically all greenbelt, so they knew they could get away without doing a local plan. And when I was leader, we didn't have the local plan thing, so we actually trying to get housing in place. But they'd moved into this situation where, because of greenbelt, they felt they could get away with not doing it. And not doing it, in a human nature point of view, is entirely logical, because it's a really painful, difficult thing to do with your local community. And if you don't have to do it, obviously as a politician and as a council, they're going to avoid doing it. So I think there is a role for central government to look at where these local plans are not being progressed. How do you do that, and what do you do that starts moving planning on? as I said, I think with Greenbelt, I think it has an important role to play, and I agree with actually everything that's been said in different formats on the panel, which is I do think the Greenbelt is hugely important, but I think we've got to be clear about not what the Greenbelt was designed and mapped out for nearly 100 years ago. What is the Greenbelt that we need and we want today? And one of the challenges with just looking at brownfield as an easy thing, and look, I agree, we're not doing enough of the brownfield development. That's absolutely right, particularly in cities like London. But there is partly a reason for that, which is it is so economically unviable in some cases that even if we were to develop it, the prices are not going to help the housing market. And that makes it quite challenging. You then have the follow-up problem that I think Anya nailed absolutely spot on, which is we then have these satellite developments built that don't create communities. They create homes that people drive to, get out their car, go in their house, hardly ever meet their neighbour because there's nothing that draws them together. I'll be upfront, not everybody's view, but I was a big fan of Poundbury because what now King Charles has done at Poundbury is create a structure. I like the architecture as well, but the planning of it there means that people are kind of driven to interact with their neighbours and get to know each other and create a community. Too many estates now built are just an estate of houses where you come and go. You do not build a community. So I think all of these have knock-on effects through our wider community. That means we're losing community cohesion. We're not building the houses we need, which affects our economy. 100,000 homes a year is 1 to 3% of GDP, depending on how you assess the supply lines. That's a massive issue for us economically, and we've got to live up to that. We've also got to be realistic about people don't necessarily want to live in a place where the work that they work in isn't. You know, you've got to be able to live and have proximity to work, because yes, we have work from home, but people still need to go to a place of work and an office. So if Great Yarmouth is saying, look, we will build another 5,000 homes in a particular part, that's brilliant in one sense, but if everybody wants to be working in Cambridge, Great Yarmouth isn't where they're going to need their homes. So we've got to actually be honest about where do we actually need the homes for the people who need them, and then get the right homes built in the right places.
Talking about having homes built in the right places, Anya, as you say, actually proximity to train stations is a key thing that's been identified. Do you have any sort of idea of what changes could be made and how many homes that could unlock if we, say, took building near train stations as an example?
Not off the top of my head, but it is an awful lot. We do have a lot of train stations in this country that are just practically in the middle of nowhere, and I can't even believe that when they planned those train stations in the first place that they intended the area around it to remain empty. I presume they intended for some development to go ahead, but then the necessary planning process was never completed for doing that. But I think what strikes me is that there is a consensus here, right, that the Greenbelt is not doing what we want it to do, either the parts that we want to preserve and the parts that we want to release, right? So there's obviously some kind of broad agreement that we could do some kind of review, that we could make more sensible decisions. You know, as you mentioned earlier, Roger, the Greenbelt was set up in the 1930s. The world has changed quite a lot since the 1930s, and our policy needs to as well. And then just another point that actually Brandon made about the kind of unwillingness of some local authorities to complete their plans, I think is a really important point. And we can change that. They are politically, they're right to be unwilling to do it, because it is such a nightmare working with communities to make agreements when not the people who would benefit from these new changes, from these new homes, are not necessarily already in that community. So of course you're kind of speaking to some people about changes that will largely benefit other people. There's a kind of mismatch there. And so local authorities are obviously going to be reluctant to take that political challenge when they could not do so. So how do we change the incentives to make local authorities want to plan, and want to plan in such a way that we deliver all of these benefits that we're kind of talking about hypothetically? I mean, there's tax reform, but there's also kind of planning reforms that get local communities on board, as I've kind of mentioned already. I just think there's so many opportunities that pretty much everyone would agree with, given this kind of level of consensus.
Can I just jump in, because there's a bit of a whole, something that's always been a bet in my mind is the railway stations point. And I agree with Anya, but I go further in that we've got two problems. One is you've got railway stations in very rural areas, which is challenging, and that was probably around originally people's ability to travel to work. But the beaching reforms actually took away so much of the railway that the connections aren't there as they used to be. And we suffer that in my constituency. But you've also got the flip side, where you've got railway stations in a lot of areas, like mine and parts on the edges of London, where the railway station is actually in pretty good proximity to where people need to be for work or retail or social, what have you, but it is not developed. And one of the successes of Crossrail, if you look in London, is some of the upward development around it that has funded it, that has transformed certain areas and been able to completely re-establish places. And we should be doing more of that. One of the challenges, because I've looked at this before, is the leadership at Network Rail have no incentive to engage in this discussion, because none of their bonuses, none of their KPIs connects to the value of their properties. It's purely about the railways running. And actually, how do we re-establish those railway stations that we're seeing lower footfall in? One of the things is put properties and offices above them and around them, and you might actually get more footfall in as well. And actually, I've got to say, with local authorities, one of the things I wanted to look at, I got promoted in 2016, so I left what was then CLG, but the next thing we would have looked at was for local authorities who don't have local plans, the next logical step to drive local plans and avoid a target. So I'm not a fan of the top-down target, is actually you make, if there is no local plan based on local housing need that is up to date, then there becomes a presumption for approval, because that gives you an absolute incentive for local authority to have their local plan and up to date. Otherwise, then it becomes a developer's market, and that's the, it sounds quite heavy-hitting, but it actually will give the local authorities the genuine, logical reason to have to keep a local plan up to date.
Yeah, I'll just come back on that point. It'd be no surprise that I completely agree with Brandon on that. And one of the points is, if you look forward to 2025, only 22% of local authorities will have an up-to-date local plan. Yeah, so nearly 80% will be out of date. If you go to the southeast of England, 40% of local plans will be over 10 years old in 2025. And so actually we're having this discussion partially because the local plan making system has actually, or is, failing at this moment in time. And it goes to the point which is a lot of local authorities, and one of the things that just in this conversation, everybody gets fixated, understandably, with the green belt around London, but the green belt is around all of our major economic centres in England, effectively, in Birmingham, in Manchester, in Leeds, in Bristol. So it affects all of them in similar ways, and all of them suffer from broadly similar situations with their local plan. As soon as you said you have no protection from unplanned development, you would never see councillors running so quickly to have put a local plan in place. And so I think that would be the ultimate sanction. Now, actually, I don't want it to happen in such a way that what you end up having is a patchwork quilt of unplanned development. But ultimately, that is what would be required to drive it in the absence of any intervention.
Yeah, I'm a big advocate for the local plan process, so agree with any of those incentives that get local plans off the blocks. I think that it's not the only block in the road in terms of delivering more housing though. And we're sitting on 500,000 homes with planning permission that are not being built out. Allocating land in the green belt doesn't necessarily mean more houses are going to be built. It just means developers who've got those planning permissions have got more choice of sites. And I think we need to look at the plan stuff alongside some of the other blocks because in a way, that 500,000 with planning permission, it's insane. We've got to be bringing forward those.
But hold on, let's also look at that 500,000 isn't really 500,000. Let's be clear about this. I mean, some of them developers aren't building out, but part of that is because when you announce and you give planning permission on 5,000 homes, they're not going to be built in a year. That is a 10, 15-year project. Also, some of the 500,000 are properties and pieces of land where developers or individuals have decided they're going to get rich by selling land and then find nobody actually wants to build there and develop there. And others are where a developer would love to get on site and get building, but they've got so many preconditions on them by the local authority that it takes a year or two to get on site. So there's a whole breakdown of reasons between the 500,000. One of the challenges we're going to have if house building is going to get moving again is house approvals and house planning approvals in the last year has dropped so dramatically that even if interest rates come down and even if builders get building again, there is such a shortage of land in the next couple of years because of what's happened in the last year that we're still going to have this real pressure on supply.
Yeah, but Brandon saved me from myself actually with that because that is one of the statistics that is thrown out, which really begins to get me going. And I'd add on to that. It's not just a developer. The state of our infrastructure, and by infrastructure I mean water, sewage treatment plants, electricity supply, all of these kind of issues. When you've got large-scale development, actually, it can be 3 years to get that in place. So when you get a planning consent, there's a 3-year lead-in time to get the infrastructure required to open up a site. So there is always going to be a stock of unimplemented consents. And then in addition, Brandon's kindly saved me from myself through going through the other reasons that there are for that stock.
But in a way, I would say the other thing we need to look at is part of the brokenness of the planning system is that, you know, most of our local planning authorities are you looking only at housing in the terms of the way they're looking at it. And you know, we've got to look at those infrastructural issues, we've got to look at energy, we've got to look at net zero alongside those things. So issues like land use strategies that would help us to look at those things in the round, I think are crucial.
And in that, I couldn't agree with you more because the problem with local plans sometimes is they focus on housing and not the other issues, including employment and infrastructure. And there is a linkage between everything, which is important for the economic growth, health, education, and so on and so forth. So I completely agree.
I do want to throw it out to the audience, so I think the microphones are ready. If you stick your hand up if you have got a question. Joe will take the chap in front of you. I'll take two at a time, so that chap, and then Mark, the gentleman behind you. If you could introduce yourselves as well, that would be appreciated.
I'm James Mills, former leader of West Oxfordshire. I delivered a local plan. I chaired the members' work on the Oxfordshire plan that got ditched. I've worked on HIF1, HIF2, and I'm glad you've just got round to mentioning things other than housing, so I will get to a question. When councillors invest in trying to bring these things forward, a lot of political capital, they need government to back them, otherwise it all falls apart. What more can be done to do that so you don't put fusion at risk, research at risk, and all the rest of it that you've got in Oxfordshire, for example?
Okay. Yeah.
Hi, Chris Howell. I'm a party member from Cambridge. I also work for a software company in the city. Cambridge Greenbelt was thought about in the 30s, implemented, I believe, in the 60s when Cambridge was a sleepy university town. Cambridge economy is now amazingly dynamic, producing some really vitally important industries. Those industries are being artificially constrained by the Cambridge Greenbelt. We are leaving enormous amounts of money for the UK economy on the table by not allowing development around Cambridge. And we're also, human well-being. These companies are curing cancer, they're solving climate change and all that kind of thing. In terms of housing, average house prices in Cambridge, I believe, are about 12 times average incomes. The effect of that is if you want a family house, you have to move way beyond sustainable commuting distance in order to afford that. We have people in there...
Sorry, can you get to the question?
The question is, the Cambridge Greenbelt has huge numbers of low-value agricultural land. It's the most appropriate places on the planet, bar none, for new housing and for new business. Is there anybody on the panel that would disagree that we should just take that out of the Greenbelt and allow the housing development in a sustainable location near Cambridge? And if so, how do we politically achieve that?
Okay. So should we effectively ditch the Cambridge Greenbelt, and what can we do to get more government support for local plans? Brandon, do you want to?
Sure. Well, and to an extent, I think my answer is kind of the same to both, but particularly with the focus on the first question. West Oxfordshire, which is, yeah, look, you're right. You need more people like me giving you the airspace. So that you're not just locally, because one of the things I do understand, I've always made this point, is having been a local authority council, when the only time my constituents ever contacted me as a council was when there was a planning issue. Actually, it's probably still a fair chunk of the mailbox, even as a member of parliament, is when there's a planning issue. So for local councillors, particularly if you're up in thirds, which is part of the kind of people are, they're always looking at the next election is less than a year away. It is entirely rational to be very nervous about difficult planning issues. So we've got to give you the airspace. You know, all of us in Westminster, I think, have a duty Obviously I'm not in government anymore, so I can talk more widely on things and go back to, and I made these cases when I was housing minister, so I'm being consistent with the position I took when I was in CLG, which is we need to be building houses and it needs people like me and others, and you're getting more of us doing this now, publicly talking about this to create the airspace. So you do absolutely need that support from central government. As I say, in terms of how you get more local plans in place, my view is you create that airspace, you put the structure in there. We've got to get more people into planning. We've not touched on the fact there are not enough planners, not enough people going into it. So the skill set is short. But I also do think, with every carrot, there's a bit of a stick. And the stick for me is if there isn't a local plan up to date, you can have some exemptions about good special, if there's some particular reason, but ultimately there would then be, to me, a statutory presumption for approval, either by the local authority or by an inspector, which would then give a more purposeful drive to areas that haven't been as forward-thinking as you guys were. And similarly in Cambridge, look, I know I met with the chairman of one of the growth partnerships across Cambridge, who's very keen on scene development. Andrew Lansley is very, very pro scene development, to recognise the massive gap there is between what our competitors internationally are doing, how fast they're developing R&D space compared to what we're doing, even with what we announced this summer. And that is down to this reaction about running away from sometimes and being fearful of this debate about the Greenbelt. So again, I think that's up to us in Westminster to stand up and make the point that we have to do this. This is the right thing for the economy. You can have Greenbelt, we should have Greenbelt, that green lung. We've got to assess what is right for the next 100 years, not being curtailed necessarily just because what was right in 1935 is not necessarily going to be right in 2035. So we've got to assess it based on current needs and create that airspace for you. But we should absolutely be getting wholesale behind that Oxford-Cambridge corridor and the development, because it's so integral to the UK. And by the way, Belfast is also there on the part of the triangle with you, because they're actually slightly ahead on terms of inward investment into tech. But yeah, we've got to actually be doing that.
On the West Oxfordshire point, I don't think we've needed planners now we need planners now more than ever before, especially if we're going to do that joined up piece. So I think the kind of hemorrhaging of planners, especially from local government, we should be cherishing the planners in local government and encouraging them to reach their full potential. This is a time for thinking about planning, having some extended responsibilities, not kind of shackling them down. And so I agree, like more power and investment into the planning process. On the Cambridge, unsurprisingly, I am going to make an argument for keeping the Greenbelt in Cambridge. I think it's one of the most water-stressed parts of the country. I think we're just in huge danger of kind of jumping into a kind of series of unintended consequences by continuing to build out in places where our infrastructure is not ready to take new development. So I think Cambridge is one of those places where those revised purposes of the Greenbelt that we talked about earlier in terms of biodiversity and climate are more valuable than they are in other places of the country. So no to that, but also I'd want to see that any new development in that city was making sure that it looked across the piece at all of those parts of infrastructure that are needed. So yeah, no, I'm going to be the person who disagrees on that one.
Anya, there's probably not many places that come close to London rental prices, but Cambridge probably is one of them. Lots of young students, young professionals, young families. What were your sort of responses to Michael Gove's announcements?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a housing person. I mainly focus on housing. I don't have so much knowledge about the kind of industrial and science side of things. But it is just amazing that we are in this situation. And by amazing, I mean utterly terrible. We have one of the leading life sciences industries in the world, right? We were so amazing that we, a relatively small country by global standards, we developed one of the COVID vaccines, right? We have this fantastic kind of heritage and these facilities, and we have many of the greatest minds in the world working here. And we have a situation where there is no new lab space available in Oxford because we don't build anything. It's just appalling, right? This is proper banging heads together kind of situation. We need to sort it out. So yes, obviously, I think we need to build the stuff. Just on the point, actually, that Roger made about kind of water stress as well, it's absolutely true. But what I would say is we haven't built a reservoir in 30 years. Why? It's the same situation whenever you go through any planning process, whether it's a reservoir or housing.
Did you want to touch on
this
point?
So a couple of points, and Anya's picked up on one of them. First of all, in relation to Cambridgeshire, I'm sure that's why the Secretary of State made his housing announcement in Cambridge in July. I will be interested, though, to see how they navigate the timings so that it delivers in the pace that the economy needs it to deliver, not at the pace that the planning system says it should be delivered in. I don't disagree on the infrastructure point. Going to Oxfordshire, I think it's very interesting that there's proposals for a reservoir in Oxfordshire, and one of the biggest campaigns with objectors is Stop the Reservoir. I think it's in the Vale of White Horse or nearby. But we haven't built sufficient infrastructure, and it seems to cause the same planning issues when they're brought forward as any other kind of development. Just looking at Oxfordshire, I just want to comment on Oxfordshire. I think you need central government support and consistency of message, because I would argue there hasn't been a consistency of message over the last 3 years. And then secondly, unfortunately, you need some consistency and agreement when you're dealing with Oxfordshire between a series of local authorities, and doing that when they're open to political change from Conservative to Lib Dem and vice versa. That is very, very difficult indeed. And in Oxfordshire, it's even more pronounced than it is in Cambridgeshire, because I think Oxfordshire's affordability ratio is 17 times in terms of Oxford City. So it is one of the most unaffordable places in the country. And yet, as Anya's highlighted, it should be the other end of the corridor. So yeah, we definitely need some consistency of political intervention in those kind of areas.
Potentially a consistency in housing minister for Malvern. A couple of months wouldn't go amiss
I think
either.
there's 9 since I left the office, and I left in, what, 16?
It's, hopefully Rachel stays in place for quite some time. Right, any more questions? Chap in the blue suit, and then the chap with the moustache behind the back. Yeah, the blue suit didn't narrow it down, did
quite
it?
wide.
I should have thought. Apologies.
I was sure you meant me.
I did.
Yeah. I've had quite an interesting experience this year. I'm 30 years old and moving from Leeds to London. So I'm selling my house in Leeds. I made a ridiculous amount of money off it just by accidentally buying in the right place. I'm moving to London, same distance from where I live now from work. And the rent is 5.5 times what my current mortgage is per month, which, as I say, I'm lucky to be able to afford it. But is not an honest one here where I've just been lucky with my house, I'm now quite unlucky, the situation I'm finding myself in. Do we not just need to carpet bomb the cities with houses? It's a simple fact, we haven't got enough houses. Do we not need to get over the fact that we had this Greenbelt thing 80 years ago and just crack on and build some houses?
I suspect I know what the answer might be, but we'll see. Next question.
Yeah. Hi, my name's Anthony Breach. I'm a senior analyst at Centre for Cities, where I lead on housing and planning. So we've heard a bit on the panel about how we need to get local plans in order and how we need sticks and carrots to get local authorities to get local plans in order. I'm interested to hear whether the panel has heard of the Californian Builders' Remedy idea and whether they'd like to see that in the UK. So a quick summary is basically, in California, you have to get a local plan in place that's sensible, reasonable, etc. And if you don't get a local plan in place as a local authority, all of your local planning powers disappear, and the developer can build whatever they want. So it's the ultimate big stick, essentially. And the idea is it would never be used, right? It's never supposed to actually deliver any houses, but it's meant to be this, stick to get new housing built. Does the panel agree with that idea? Does it agree it should apply to the Greenbelt? Interested in some perspectives. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I mean, to an extent, that's a variation of what I was saying about presumption of approval. And the other thing you see in some parts of America is they'll have a zonal planning system with design codes, and if you go within the zonal system with a design code, just crack on, you move at pace. If you want to do something different, then you've got to go through a process. We actually, if you look at the 2016 Housing and Planning Act, the framework is there to have a version of a zonal system for the UK, which has a knock-on effect of working with small and medium-sized builders, which we have lost in their droves, thousands over the last decade or so. And one of the challenges for SMEs is if you want to go and build, you've got to go to the bank. You go to the bank, they won't lend you money until you've got planning, and planning is expensive and slow, and they're just not coming back. So zonal system changes the discussion with the bank from gambling on maybe getting planning to I know I can build 5 houses, I've just got to get a decision about what they look like. So I think I think there's a lot to learn from what they're doing in America. If you get it right, it's got to have protections in, but yes, I think there is something in that. In terms of housing, like, yeah, I mean, we do need to be building more. I mean, one of the challenges in cities as well moves away from the green belt, but also around one of the things you see in America again actually is much bigger prominence of the PRS market. Has a different style, they call it all-life housing. Much bigger, very different type of population that don't necessarily need to or want to look to own their own home. It's never quite developed in the UK in the same way. There's a bit in London, a bit in Manchester, which I'm actually, it's weird driving in, seeing buildings I went round when they were shells actually as the minister a few years ago, but and Leeds, but we've not really cracked that here. Now that's partly because of the tax system here and the way we tax and put up stamp duty a few years ago because the institutional investors don't go into that level, developers do, so it's high risk. So there's a lot of other issues that play into that beyond the green belt around why we're not seeing more. But ultimately, look, the bottom line is so many of these things is, whether it's PRS, affordable, social, build to own, we are not building enough homes in this country, and we've got to look at this in the round. It's not just about green belt. I absolutely agree with Roger. There's a lot of different things, a lot of little dials we need to shift to get more houses built in this country. If we build 300,000 a year for a few years, we're still going to be behind where demand is because of what we've not built in the last 20 years.
I'm not going to disagree on the housing numbers. I think we need to build more houses. I think they just need to be in the right place. I don't think carpet bombing houses in the city is a bad idea. I just don't think they should be in the green belt. So I'm all for that. So just on the California model, from what I understand, I just picks up on the comments I made earlier around land use strategy. My understanding is it starts with a spatial strategy that allows us to think about infrastructure across the piece. At the moment, we plan in boxes. We plan for houses in local planning authorities. We plan what happens in agriculture with landowners and with DEFRA. We plan infrastructure, transport infrastructure at top tier local authority, at a different local authority level. It's bonkers. You know, we've got the joy of that California model is that it looks at all our spatial planning needs in one place and then comes up with a coherent plan after that. So as well as the stick bit of that, I think the carrot piece of that California model is something that we should be really looking at.
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't use the phrase carpet bombing, but I mean, but of course I'm going to basically say we should be building more houses. And I'll actually, the other question of working for Centre for Cities, CPS, I mean, they're basically coming up with broadly the same numbers, which is we're at least 2.5 million homes, maybe 4 million homes behind where we need to be at this moment in time. So the task of building houses is a huge one, and as the Minister, Rachel McLean's been saying, you know, we should all be wearing T-shirts saying, just build bloody houses. Everybody, whether they're orange, blue, red, I don't care. That should be the message now that we need to build them. I think the Fabian Society have picked up on this builder's remedy, Anthony, and they're running with it. It does require a zoning system. It does require a local plan. And if you don't have a local plan effectively, away you go. And as Brandon said, I think we've basically said that that probably is the ultimate sanction in our current system that you would have. But that shouldn't be where we need to be. But sadly, that could be where we will get to ensure that we do deliver the housing that we need.
We've got just a couple of minutes left, and I do want to make sure I finish on time. So I'm going to end with potentially the most difficult question. I'm sorry, that's terribly unfair, but if we start with Paul and move round. I think we've probably all agreed that we probably should rethink the green belt. We may disagree on how and why and in what way, but we've all agreed that it's not working for now. How do we implement that sort of change? Do we need to persuade MPs? Do we need to persuade local councillors? Or do we need to persuade the public to sort of detach from their emotional connection with Greenbelt as all rolling fields and actually get a bit more realism in it? If we want to rethink the Greenbelt, how do we go about it?
So as I opened, I think it's a bit of all of those things. I think there's a bit of education about what Greenbelt actually is and what it maybe should be, and that may be some of the things that Roger's talked about as well, in terms of getting different priorities. But actually, education is important. Greenbelt isn't what you think it is at the moment. And then I think we should have local plans. And personally, I would actually say you do need to have that ultimate sanction, which is Greenbelt does not have the protection from the presumption in favour, which it currently has in policy. And as I say, you would never see local plans made more quickly than if that happened.
Anya?
It's got to come from national government, right? Ultimately, the Greenbelt is set up at the national level, and national government will have to lead on that process to make those changes. I do, however, think it is actually perfectly possible, right? If you go to the public and say, I'm going to scrap the Greenbelt, they're going to go absolutely doolally. If you go to the public and say, we are going to improve the Greenbelt, we are going to fix the Greenbelt, we are going to add extra protections or rights of access to the bits that we think are amenable to the public to go walking in or whatever, but we're also in that process going to review the bits that really aren't worth protecting. And honestly, I don't even mind. You could increase the size of the Greenbelt. You could increase the size of the Greenbelt by releasing the bits that are around train stations, whatever, and adding protections to other areas that are not right next to cities. And you can go to the public and say, we're actually increasing the size of the Greenbelt. But then you deal with all of these problems that we've discussed with it. And then you can actually allow it to achieve the goals it was designed to achieve in the first place. So I think it's possible, but that needs to really be driven at the national level by a government that is willing to take on that challenge.
I think probably we'll all agree that we need some reform of the planning system. I think if we embrace the land use framework, land use strategy approach to planning reform, in a sense, I think that demonstrates the value of the Greenbelt that we've been talking about. I think in that approach, we're going to find much more space close to settlement for well-being, for climate, for nature, for energy, for other infrastructure. I think in a way that would be that would be the framework that I think helps us to value the Greenbelt for what it could deliver in the 21st century.
Last but not least.
So I think it's a layered approach. Ultimately, it will require central government to legislate, to update, change, and review Greenbelt. But for central government to take that on with all of the other pressures in central government, you've got to have the layers before that, which means we've got to have a public debate about it. At the moment, most politicians who human nature, entirely rationally, whether it's local or national politicians, have got to get re-elected. And at the moment, if you go out and say, I'm going to go and reform the Greenbelt, change the Greenbelt, you're going to be, as I say, absolutely held up in not necessarily the most polite ways, particularly in the rural communities. So we've got to start having that public debate. Much comes back to my point about the air war, create the airspace. Public debate, so it becomes the normal thing to have a conversation about what this is. So you start building that. So the public become, as Paul said, more aware of it. We all start having a discussion, as Roger and Anya said, what do we want the Greenbelt to be? What is it there for? How does it actually deliver what it was always intended to deliver? That then opens the space for central government to say, right, this has been a debate, this is an open discussion, everybody's fed into this, it's time now to reflect that and actually take legislation forward. So it would take a year or two for government to do it, but it's got to start somewhere. And the lead, I think, yes, it has to come from central government.
All right. Well, thank you very much all for coming. I hope you'll join me in thanking our speakers and the LPDF for sponsoring. If you'd like to hang around, our next event is How the UK Can Become a Tech Superpower with Michelle Donnellan. If you're interested in the CPS's work, you can sign up to our newsletter, speak to a member of staff, and pick up a copy of the Case for House Building